Butler. I'm the historian for the Charleston County Public Library, and it's my great pleasure to be able to share local history with the public. And when I'm talking about history, whether I'm talking about bicycle history, which is tomorrow night's topic, or dance history, music history, transportation history, fortification history, military history, food history, beverages history, history of slavery, history of rice, all kinds of topics, I always try to point out the relevancy of these historical topics to our lives in Charleston. 8th graders throughout South Carolina are learning about South Carolina history during their school year. So here it is, May, it's towards the end of the school year. 8th graders are learning about modern South Carolina and recent developments, industrialization and the late 20th century boom and tourism and things like that. And instead of talking about modern South Carolina for 8th graders, I decided I wanted to do something that's a little more philosophical, a little bit more review-oriented, and really hope that I didn't get too far over the head of 8th graders and bore them to tears. But, you know, that's a risk we all have to take. So today's topic, is South Carolina history relevant? Is an exercise in kind of thinking about the past and thinking about the present, thinking about the meaning of the past in the present, and how all of these topics that I just mentioned, how all of these and many other topics impact our lives today. And before I forget, let me share a phrase with you to think about, and maybe this will have more relevance as you are leaving the library today. You know, there's a lot of talk in the media about a movement called Black Lives Matter. Well, me and some historian friends of mine, and I can't take credit for originating this term, but people in our little history community have started using this phrase, past lives matter, because the lives that created the world around us in the past, they're vestiges of their lives still among us today, and we're living among the vestiges of the past. And that's a low country South Carolina phenomenon, but it's also a universal phenomenon. But to us, it has special meaning. So that's kind of the impetus for today's program. So I've got some pictures and I've got some stories as examples, but I've also got some philosophical ideas for brainstorming and things maybe you can think about after you leave today's program. So why study history? Why do we make school kids learn history? And as adults, why do we get interested in history? Well, there are all kinds of good reasons, and educators are always coming up with rationalizations for why we teach history, such as, well, we have to remind ourselves that despite some of the textbooks we all had when we were growing up, history is more than just memorizing names and dates. It's so much more than just names and dates. And I think we do a real disservice to children when we just emphasize the memorization, rote memorization of names and dates and events. We need bigger picture, the context. So we study history at school to prepare us for life as an adult. And so if you're a stockbroker or a backhoe driver or a grocery clerk, what does history have to do with your lives? Well, it has a lot to do with your life as an adult. And that's where we're headed today. And you may hear teachers, educators throwing this phrase around, we have to learn from the past because the school children that we're educating today are our future and their future and our community's future. So we have to learn about the past to prepare for the future. And historians, educators, school administrators are always coming up with more specific intellectual reasons. Why do we have to study history? Well, we study history to develop cognitive skills, reading and writing and communicating, reading stories and talking about those and writing essays. And that involves critical thinking skills. We have to read and digest, analyze and synthesize and be able to tell the stories back. We have to learn stories and then tell those stories back as a way of synthesizing information. And we learn problem solving. How did General Francis Marion come up with methods to defeat the British in the backcountry of South Carolina? Well, he's using problem-solving skills that he developed as a young man. And all young children need to learn problem-solving skills. And that's just one example. But why do we study local history specifically? Why in the state of South Carolina are 8th graders required to learn South Carolina history? So what's the purpose? Well, we're trying to understand our surroundings, our strange surroundings, and to help us develop an identity. And that's something I think is important, not just for 8th graders in general, but 8th graders on John's Island, to learn something about their surroundings to help them develop an identity. And I love telling school children that this is going to be important. It may not seem important to you right now as an 8th grader, but when you leave Johns Island, when you leave the Charleston community and you go to Paris or Seattle, or you go to Toronto, or you go to Caracas, people are going to say, where are you from? And so you're carrying your identity from Johns Island or Charleston, wherever you go. And people may have preconceived ideas about what South Carolina history means, and they're going to say, oh, you're from that place. And so you have to understand that as you grow up and leave this area, you're going to be an ambassador, basically, for the community and represent our history. So it helps us form an identity, and it helps us develop life skills that create stronger citizens. You know, we learn about how citizens worked in South Carolina's past to help us be better South Carolina citizens, which helps us be better United States citizens and world citizens as well. But really, when I come to think about why studying local history, this is what I think. History is about stories, and everybody loves stories. This is why libraries were created, so people could instruct themselves, educate themselves, and also today you think about people going to the public library, we check out DVDs, we check out novels. People are all about stories because that's something that defines our humanity since the beginning of civilization. People love stories because stories help us to understand our world and to find our identity in stories about the past and help us, you know, insert ourselves into the continuum of time. Stories that inspire us, whether it's Francis Marion, who I mentioned a little while ago, or enslaved people who also served in the American Revolution. Their stories might inspire young people coming up today, or inspire us to delve further into our community's history or world history. Inspire us to learn more. And what more could we ask of people on their way to adulthood, or people who are already comfortably adults, to inspire people to learn more, to become more engaged in the world around them. I think that's what history can really do. So what are the themes, or some of the themes in South Carolina history? So if you're an 8th grader and you've been through a year-long session of South Carolina history from colonial times to modern history, what are some of the things along the way? Well, things like colonialism, the idea that we came here and brushed aside the people who were already here and brought in a pre-existing kind of culture and tried to replicate a culture that was coming from overseas. That is a long, deep part of our cultural history here. Diversity is also an extremely big theme in South Carolina history because this was a European, specifically English colony in the 1670s when this place got started, but it rapidly turned into a very diverse place. And I'm going to come back to that theme of diversity shortly. One of the themes that we have to acknowledge in South Carolina history is greed and exploitation. Actually, two themes that are kind of tied together. That goes back to the idea of colonialism. We came here, brushed the people aside, took the land, and tried to exploit the land and squeeze every dollar that we could make out of the land. And that involved bringing in laborers who we could exploit to make more money. So really the basis of South Carolina is about greed and exploitation. And that's a dark part of our history that we have to acknowledge. And coming along with that is the theme of prejudice and discrimination. That's a big part of our history. And we can't shy away from that. We have to acknowledge that, to embrace it, and learn from that and move along. Violence, intimidation. More of the same. These are definite themes in South Carolina history that we can't sweep under the rug. We have to acknowledge them. Because the flip side of violence and intimidation is courage and perseverance. People who withstood all of the evils of the past and form a valuable part of our community today. And we have to be able to see the theme of inequality in South Carolina. Not only the inequality between people of different backgrounds, but also the gap between the rich and the poor. And that's a big part of South Carolina's history, and it's a theme that you hear about in United States history as well. the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. That's been part of our legacy for a very long time. And an interesting theme in South Carolina history is boom and bust, the idea of coming here, starting with nothing, making lots of money, losing everything, starting over, making money, losing everything, starting over, making money. And that is a resiliency that defines South Carolina. Not just some people of South Carolina, but all the people of South Carolina. So resiliency is a wonderful trait that we need to carry into the future. And that's, fortunately, a big part of our legacy here in South Carolina. So let me just give you some examples of these things. So rice is a colonial phenomenon. People came here and 300 odd years ago and said, how can we make money off this land? Perhaps we can grow commodities that we can sell for a great profit back in England. And rice happened to be one of many commodities that people started off experimenting with in the early days of Carolina. And it turned into a very profitable and very important crop for the Low Country. And it dominated our colonial economy. From the 1690s all the way up to the American Revolution and all the way up to the Civil War, rice is a big part of Charleston and Low Country economy. And in the 1740s up to through the 1780s, indigo was a big part of the South Carolina economy. We're using the natural resources, exploiting the natural resources, exploiting labor, and making a lot of money by taking something back to the old country, part of our colonial mechanism. So squeezing and distilling this blue dye from the leaves of this plant to color the clothing of European garments. And so blue is a theme, the indigo blue is a theme in South Carolina history, and happens to be my favorite color. Not because it's a pretty shade of blue, because it represents a big part of South Carolina history. And then after the American Revolution, cotton, which had always been produced in small quantities in South Carolina, in the 1790s finally becomes a big cash crop. And all the way into the 1920s, cotton is a big part of the Low Country economy. And once again, we're exploiting the natural resources and exploiting labor that's available here and making the rich even richer and the poor even poorer. So when you think about Charleston history, and try for a moment to think of Charleston history as a tourist, you think about the grandeur of Charleston, the gentility of Charleston, think about the big rich houses. Well, that's just a fraction of the population. And that is money and prestige and power that's created on the backs of the vast majority of people. So this is one part of Charleston history that many people celebrate. And it's fine to celebrate and commemorate that, but it's not all of Charleston history. Because all of that wealth was produced on the backs of enslaved Africans who were brought here in large numbers. So slavery in early South Carolina is the engine that drives commerce. Now, we don't have a manufacturing kind of economy, we have an agricultural kind of economy in South Carolina all the way into the 20th century. That is the root of our economy, and it's made possible by large numbers of enslaved Africans who were coming in. And this is an image that you may be familiar with from the beginning of the 19th century. This is talking about the evils of overcrowding ships that are bringing Africans to the Americas. And you can't talk about South Carolina history without acknowledging the fact that thousands of people were stolen, were kidnapped, dragged away from Africa and brought and forced to labor in the fields of South Carolina and in the towns and the streets of South Carolina. So slavery is an urban phenomenon. Slavery is a rural phenomenon. Slavery is something that dominated the early history of South Carolina. And if you look at some of these newspaper advertisements, you can see the evidence of the past. These are primary source documents that tell us about Africans being brought here. And on the eve of the American Revolution, when white South Carolinians and white colonists up and down the Atlantic coast are talking about British tyranny turning American colonists into slaves, at the same time we are enslaving large numbers of Africans. On the eve of the American Revolution, and then immediately after the American Revolution, South Carolina gets back into re-importing Africans directly to the port of Charleston, when most other states, almost all other states, got out of that business. And by the early 19th century, South Carolina is alone in the United States in bringing in Africans into the port of Charleston. And so we have to examine some of the raw data. That's definitely part of our legacy. So how many African captives were brought into South Carolina? From the beginning of this colony in 1670, and the earliest Africans came in just a few months after the first settlers. Between 1670 and the eve of the American Revolution, 1775, approximately 95,000 Africans were brought into the port of Charleston. So just Charleston alone. So in that period of just over 100 years, 95,000 Africans. And then after the American Revolution, when most states washed their hands of slavery, we brought in an additional 97,000, more or less. That number may be a little higher, maybe a little bit lower. All the way up until January 1st, 1808, when the federal government said no more Africans can be brought into the port of Charleston. So we're talking about a total of approximately 192,000 Africans brought against their will into the port of Charleston to labor in the Low Country, in backcountry South Carolina, and beyond. Many of those people went through the port of Charleston, through this community, and then on to other places in the United States. So, how does that compare with the rest of the country? How does Charleston's tradition, Charleston's addiction to slavery, how does that compare to the rest of the country? So, if you look at all of North America, including Canada, between 1618, when the first Africans are brought to the colony of Virginia, all the way up to January 1st, 1808, when the slave trade was officially outlawed, or when the importation of new Africans was officially outlawed. We're talking about more or less 500,000 people brought from Africa, which sounds like a lot of people. That's 500,000 people brought to North America. But consider that about 10 million went to just South America. So this is not that huge of a number when you look at the slave trade in the New World in general. So 500,000, all of North America. And remember that about 192,000, maybe as many as 200,000, came through the port of Charleston and came through our community. We can justifiably say by looking at these numbers that nearly 40% of all African Americans, African captives who were brought to the New World, to North America, came through the port of Charleston. 40% of all Africans brought to North America came through our community. So South Carolina, and especially Charleston and the Charleston area, has a legacy of involvement with the slave trade that is on a scale very different from every other community in the United States. And some people may look at that as a negative. Some people might say, well, my ancestors were enslaved people, therefore I am not, as much of a citizen as European Americans. But that kind of prejudice had been beaten into people's minds because of the legacy of slavery. And in the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, people like James Brown are standing up and taking that potentially negative aspect and saying, yes, my ancestors were brought here as enslaved workers, enslaved laborers, against their will. But instead of being ashamed of that kind of legacy, that kind of heritage, I'm going to embrace it and say, yes, that's who I am, that's my identity. James Brown is a black South Carolinian who's saying, you know what, I'm proud of that. That's me, and that's who I am. I'm not going to hide from it, I'm going to embrace it. And that is a big part of the Civil Rights Movement in the late 1960s, but it's a big part of South Carolina's identity. And this is an inspiration for all kinds of people in South Carolina in the 1960s and 70s, all the way up to today. So how can we benefit, like James Brown, how can we benefit from our knowledge of South Carolina history? Well, here's just a few ideas that I've come up with, and hopefully you have your own as well. So I think by studying South Carolina history, we can have a greater respect for those who paved the way before us. Not just people like Francis Marion and heroes of the American Revolution and important governors and rich folks, but also for the laborers who worked the land and the craftsmen who built the structures that are now part of our community. So rich and poor, all kinds of people created the world around us, and we need to respect those people. And also, we can learn from South Carolina history to better see the difference between justice and injustice. South Carolina history is fraught with injustice. And by learning about that, we understand and recognize it. And we can identify injustice in the world around us. And that makes us better citizens. And also, we can better recognize discrimination and prejudice. Sometimes discrimination and prejudice is very subtle. And South Carolina's history is full of all kinds of very subtle and very obvious prejudice and discrimination. And by learning about the history of discrimination in our community, we can better equip ourselves and our young people for facing and identifying and rectifying injustice, discrimination, and prejudice in our community today. And learning South Carolina history will help us better appreciate the freedoms and protections we enjoy. School children get to go to school for free in South Carolina, like in other American states. And that's something that was a hard-fought luxury that many people take for granted today. But we should not take for granted the protections that we enjoy. There are a number of protections, freedoms that are enshrined in our U.S. Constitution that are only there because people fought very hard to make these things possible. So the freedom to worship as you see fit, the freedom to have access to jobs and economic prosperity regardless of your family background, regardless of the color of your skin, regardless of the fact that you're a male or a female. It doesn't matter, or it should not matter. And that is part of our legacy, those hard-won freedoms. And also, to better see the vestiges of the past in our world. And that's one of the things that I love the most about South Carolina history and Low Country history, is you can walk around anywhere in our community and literally see the vestiges of the past. And this is something that you can't find everywhere in our great country. So I'll just give you a few examples of the vestiges of the past that are all around us. Maybe we take it for granted, we don't see them. Things like place names. This is John's Island. You are on Maybank Road to come here. What's the history of those names? What does that tell us about the past? If you go down the road, there's a street or a thoroughfare called Bohicket Road. Where did that name Bohicket come from? Somebody didn't pick those syllables and say that's a euphonious kind of name. No, that's a name of a Native American tribe that was once in this area. They're long gone, but that name, that vestige, survives to this day. Foodways like rice, okra, benny, or sesame seeds. These are things that were brought here once upon a time in the early days of Carolina that were foreign to this area, but now are staples of our foodways. So okra is something that was brought here from West Africa. Benny seeds, which are sesame seeds, are brought here from West Africa. And there are all kinds of traditions in our community's food traditions that are part of vestiges of our past. Surnames. So if you look around at the surnames in this area, there are many people of African descent who have European, French, English, Scottish surnames. How did that happen? That is an American phenomenon that's part of vestiges of our past in taking people from Africa and bringing them into a world of slavery and creating a new identity for them. That is something that is a big part of our community. Accents. You might hear a variety of accents. Some here on John's Island, you might hear a Gullah or a Geechee accent, and that's something that is unique to our Low Country community. That's something that's a big vestige of our past, taking African tribal languages and mixing them with English and finding a common denominator where enslaved people and free people in this community once upon a time could communicate with each other, developing a lingua franca out of many different languages. And the people themselves, the fact that early Carolina was made up of a wide variety of European peoples as well as a wide variety of West African peoples. So we had a diversity in Carolina from the earliest days of this colony that many other colonies did not enjoy. And literally you can find the vestiges of the past by digging in the ground. And through archaeology we find the literal vestiges of the past, and those objects, those artifacts help us to learn about how people lived and who they were and understand the world that they created before us. And I'll give you some more examples of those. So here's a picture of the Cooper River on the bottom right and downtown Charleston on the top. This is a picture that shows a cruise ship that's just docked at the east end of Market Street in Charleston. Now, this big expanse of concrete and pilings is a port that was built, or a dock area, that was built by the State Ports Authority in the 1960s. The 1960s, the State Ports Authority came in and took that piece of property and said, this is disused property, it's never been used for much, we're going to take it over and turn this into a large port terminal. And today that's being used for these passenger cruise ships to dock. But that area actually had quite a bit of history. Where these passengers are unloading at the end of this dock, that dock that the State Ports Authority to this day says it doesn't have any history except just large-scale commercial import-export shipping. That exact spot was for 2 centuries, more than 2 centuries, before the State Ports Authority took it, was the home base of the Mosquito fleet. So the fishermen of early Charleston, all the way up to the year 1960, are using that wharf at the east end of Market Street as their home base. So going out in small rowing boats and sailing boats into the Gulf Stream, catching fish, bringing them back to Charleston every single day. This is a big part of our community's history, and it's part of the African American legacy. And in the 1960s, the State Ports Authority swept it aside and said, this history doesn't count as history. And to this day, the State Ports Authority is saying, this area has no significant history. By enlarging that cruise ship terminal, we're not doing any damage to anybody's history. Well, I think the ancestors of these people, or the descendants of these people, should argue otherwise. This was something that was continuing into the 1950s, and these are scans of bad newspaper photographs. That area is being purchased in the 1950s by the State Ports Authorities, and by the year 1960, the fishermen are evicted, and their Fishermans Wharf is dismantled to make way for this giant container port terminal that's now a passenger terminal for the cruise ships. So that's just one example of a knowledge of history helps us to preserve the vestiges of the past, instead of taking some people's history and wiping it clear. So when you think about history in a place like Charleston, one thing that comes to mind is historic preservation, which is about preserving the actual built environment of the past, like Rainbow Road that you see here. So in the United States, Charleston kind of invented historic preservation. You know, people in Europe have things that were older than us, and they've been preserving things for a while. But in the United States, in the early 20th century, we are not really as historically conscious as Europe is. But in Charleston, people were a little different. In the year 1920, a group of people formed an organization called the Preservation Society of Charleston, specifically to preserve the fabric, the buildings of the past, so that they would not be torn down to make way for new ugly buildings. So people were recognizing these old buildings, yes, they may be in need of repair, but they represent our past and past lives and the history of our community. We should preserve them. And so the organization was founded in 1920 to advocate for preservation of buildings. And they convinced the city of Charleston in 1931 to pass an ordinance specifically mandating the preservation, or at least attempts to preserve, old buildings in Charleston. This is the beginning of historic preservation legislation in the United States. In 1947, another group formed here in Charleston, the Historic Charleston Foundation, really to do a similar objective as the Preservation Society, but specifically buying buildings, restoring them, and selling them again to the public. So a way to really facilitate historic preservation in Charleston. In 1949 is actually when the United States government got into the act and formed the National Trust for Historic Preservation at the national level. But that organization, formed in 1949, was really inspired by the work going on in our community in the 1920s and 1930s. So historic preservation is originally about preserving old buildings, but it's also about preserving nature. So we can say the same thing about preserving natural environments in our community. So here you're looking at a mid-20th century painting of a rice field by Alice Ravenel U.G. Smith. And so these landscapes that are now preserved are preserved why did they remain in the state that they are for so long? Because they were used for agricultural purposes. There are hundreds of thousands of acres of the low country of South Carolina that were being used for rice cultivation, for cotton and indigo cultivation. And because of our long agricultural history, they were preserved for many, many generations in a state of near original preservation. After the Civil War, we didn't have the money to sell these lands off and develop them and subdivide them and build new communities. But northern investors came down, bought up these old rice plantations and other plantations for game or wildlife preserves. And because of that northern money coming down after the Civil War, specifically in the early 20th century, these properties got preserved and now they've become nature reserves. So in 1976, Tom Yawkey donated about 20,000 acres to create a new preserve that's now called the Tom Yawkey Wildlife Preserve on the border of Georgetown County and Charleston County, South Carolina. And this was the first large nature preserve in South Carolina on the coastline that was set aside by a private citizen. And it is preserving intact rice fields. And those rice fields are a legacy, an artifact, a vestige of the enslaved past. In 1988, a group of people created in the Ashepoo, Cumbie, Edisto River basins an area of preserved space that are also old rice fields. And combined with the area of St. Helena Sound, we're talking about more than 200,000 acres of nature preserves. It doesn't look exactly like it did when the Native Americans were here before the European settlers come. It looks like the land as it was used in the aftermath of generations of years of rice cultivation. So these huge nature preserves are part of our attempts to preserve the vestiges of the past. And there's an active group today, the Coastal Conservation League, that's advocating for the continuing preservation of more of the natural landscape. Not just undisturbed natural landscapes, but the landscapes that interpret and tell us the legacy of slavery and the vestiges of slavery. So people come to Charleston. Tourism is our #1 economy right now. It's the #1 industry, if you will, in our economy. But that wasn't always the case. And so Charleston this is an example of that theme of resiliency. Charleston has taken a negative and turned it into a positive. Taken the fact that after the Civil War, our economy was devastated and we were too poor to whitewash, too poor to paint and too proud to whitewash. That's the phrase. We didn't have the money to tear things down and rebuild after the Civil War. We didn't have the money after the earthquake of 1886 to tear things down and rebuild. So we made do with what we had. And then in the 1920s, 1930s, turned that into a virtue, taking the fact that Charleston was an antiquated, kind of old-fashioned, out-of-date built environment and turned that into a tourist attraction. And so today, approximately 5 million tourists are coming through the Low Country every year. To see what? They're coming here to see the vestiges of the past. The vestiges, the collection, the density of vestiges of the past that you can't find in many other communities. Places like Drayton Hall, that is, yes, it's a big fancy house, but it's also a landscape of slavery. And so you can learn lots of stories and lots of lessons about the past by visiting a place like downtown Charleston or a rural place like Drayton Hall. So tourists are coming to town not because we have roller coasters and not because we have a priceless collection of European art in big fancy museums, but because we have vestiges of the past. And so we've taken those vestiges and turned it into a big part of our economy. And more people coming here, more people visiting and moving here are causing some traffic jams, right? Just a few traffic jams. And so the city, the county, the state are considering the situation that we're in with transportation and transit. So in 2014, the City of Charleston and the Historic Charleston Foundation hired a transportation consultant to come in and look at the transportation problem in downtown Charleston and the surrounding communities and to come up with some recommendations. This is a nationally acknowledged, internationally acknowledged transportation expert. And he came up with a list of recommendations. And number one is bring back the trolley system. So to improve the present, to improve the future, he's saying we need to go back to the past. Charleston once had a robust trolley system, a streetcar system in downtown Charleston. And that streetcar system connected to the suburbs. So you didn't need a car to get from North Charleston to the Battery in downtown Charleston. So once upon a time, starting immediately after the Civil War, we had horse-drawn streetcars. And then those streetcars were electrified in 1897, as you see in this photograph. So electric trolleys on the streets of Charleston from 1897 all the way into the 1930s. And here's an example of the trolley system that would take you from downtown Charleston to the Navy base in North Charleston. So you did not need to own a car to move around in our community. But in the 1930s, we got infatuated with diesel buses and the new automobiles. And everyone thought, this is the wave of the future. This is much better. We need to get on board with that. So these are buses that will take you around Charleston instead of the trolleys. That was 1934 when the city invested in the first of the diesel buses. 4 years later, in February of 1938, we got rid of our electric trolleys in favor of automobiles and buses. And this is a newspaper photograph of the last day, on the 10th of February 1938, the last roundup of electric streetcars in Charleston. And on the 10th of February 1938, diesel buses literally pushed the old trolleys off the road. And it was a new, bright world. Everyone was really happy about that because the number of cars on the road was much lower than it is now. Now we're facing a real transportation situation. And that transportation consultant is saying we need to get back to the trolley system, or at least something like that. So that's a debate that's going on. Charleston City Council tonight is going to be talking about this topic. And speaking of Charleston City government, they've got new offices in this brand new sparkly Gilyard Center that's downtown Charleston at Calhoun Street. And the Gilyard Center is a new retrofit of a 1960s performance space. But you may not remember that a few years ago when they were working on this building at the intersection of Anson Street and George Street, they came across a number of bodies. And so the construction had to halt for a minute and an archaeological dig started and they removed 30-odd bodies from this area. And there have been some tests that have been done to determine these were all people of African descent who were buried at the end of the 18th century, maybe the early 19th century. But the city and archaeologists and historians were a little mystified because this was a burial ground of dozens of people that was not on any map that anybody had. So it's an unmarked burial ground. At least in the 20th and 21st century, it's an unmarked burial ground. Maybe it had been marked in the 18th and 19th century, but someone decided the history of the people buried here, that doesn't matter. And they swept aside the signage. And the memory of the fact that this was an African-American burial ground was lost to the community, only to be rediscovered by archaeologists in 2013. So when you think about the Gilyard Center, this is a building that's on top of vestiges of the past. These people have been exhumed, they have been put elsewhere, and the city is soon going to be releasing some more information about the reburial of these people. So keep your eyes posted for that information. And also, speaking of African American history, I want to talk about a new development coming up soon about Gaston's Wharf. Now, Gaston's Wharf may not be meaningful to you at all. Christopher Gaston in the 1760s built the largest wharf in the United States, or what would become the United States, in the 1760s on the Cooper River side at the east end of what is now Calhoun Street. In 1806, Charleston City Council, during the final feeding frenzy of the African slave trade, bringing fresh Africans from Africa to Charleston, the city of Charleston appointed that all of those incoming African ships bringing enslaved people into the port of Charleston cannot go to any wharf except Gaston's Wharf while they have any kind of enslaved people on board. So Gaston's Wharf, during the final 2 years of what was literally a feeding frenzy, bringing Africans into the port of Charleston, was the destination for tens of thousands of people. So where is Gaston's Wharf? Well, here's an 1802 map of Charleston. Gaston's Wharf is at the bottom right of the screen. If we zoom in there, Gaston's Wharf is this large area at the east end of Calhoun Street. And this is the place where tens of thousands of Africans disembarked for the first time in the New World. And that's where they were sold into a life of slavery, right there on Gaston's Wharf, in these long rectangular warehouses that were converted into basically temporary barracks for tens of thousands of Africans who were newly arrived from Africa. And so, as an example, if you look through the newspaper during that time period, here's John Watson and Company, who have just brought in the ship Kate's cargo, consisting of 340 prime Congo slaves, packed very tightly on the slave ship to be sold at Gaston's Wharf. So Gaston's Wharf is a place that legitimately has deep African American history. And here's Gaston's Wharf today. And this site, where tens of thousands of Africans first stepped off, is going to be the site of the new African American Museum. And if you look closely at this photograph that was in the News and Courier about a year ago, Post and Courier, there's a stripe here that's a slightly different color, because archaeologists, at the city's request, archaeologists went in and dug a trench, and the question was, those brick warehouses that were on Gaston's Wharf, where the Africans were sheltered while they were being sold, do any foundations, any remnants of those buildings actually exist? So they came out, dug a trench, and they found exactly that. Brick foundations of the warehouses under which those Africans were sold in 1806, 1807, 1808. That's going to be the site of that African American Museum. So that museum will include actual vestiges of that era of slavery right on that site. So my favorite theme of all of this in South Carolina history is diversity and resilience. South Carolina is a colony that turned into a state that has a really dark history. We have to acknowledge that the growth, the prosperity, the survival, all of everything that was positive in many people's eyes, like wealth and power, political power, economic power, building fancy buildings, building great plantations, all of those wonderful things are built on the backs of slavery. So there's a dark underbelly to all of South Carolina's history. And that is a negative that we can turn into a positive, because that greed and that economic engine driven by slavery was the mechanism by which almost 200,000 people are brought into our community. And without those people here, without the descendants of those people here, we would not have the diverse community that we have. And diversity is something that's a global phenomenon. We're all different, and the more we can embrace the concept of diversity, the stronger we are. So in South Carolina, we have a diversity of population that is different from other places in the world. But if we can embrace and revel in the diversity here, then we can go to other countries and embrace their diversity. And that's something that in a global economy is even more and more important. So turning a negative into a positive is something that defines South Carolina, and specifically Charleston and Low Country history. And that's a big part of our future. And we can't be swayed by the people who don't get the picture. People like Dylan Roof, who look at that underbelly of South Carolina's past and say, these African people should never have been here. This is a white society. We need to get rid of those people. That is the wrong way to look at history. And Dylan Roof was a student of history. Here he is at the Angel Oak on Johns Island. Here he is at Middleton Place Plantation. He's studying the past. He went to Sullivan's Island. He went to a slave cemetery. He's learning about our enslaved past. And he's taking the past and twisting it to suit a demented kind of philosophy about the past. We can't let this kind of message be the dominant message, because the opposite of this is true. You know, the people that were brought here against their will as enslaved laborers, that is a deep stain on our state's legacy. We can't do anything about that now. But we can embrace the fact that we have a more diverse community because of that fact. And that diversity is one of our real strengths. So how is South Carolina history relevant? Well, it's relevant, yes, because it fosters an appreciation of diversity and shared humanity. The more we get to know each other, the more we can see humanity in each other's eyes, and it makes us a more peaceful community. South Carolina history is relevant because our shared histories build a stronger community. It's not just my history or your history, it's our history together. So we can't pick and choose which parts we want to acknowledge or repress. It's all our history, and for better or for worse, it's who we are, and we need to acknowledge that and let it help us make a stronger community. South Carolina history is relevant because, just like in music, many different voices make a stronger chorus. Everybody singing the same tune at the same pitch is not that interesting. But when you have different voices singing different pitches, different timbres, you have a stronger, more harmonious chorus. South Carolina history is relevant because we must learn from the mistakes of the past. We have to learn from the mistakes of the past. But first, we have to actually recognize the mistakes of the past and recognize that some of those things we did in the past were in fact bad or evil, inexcusable. But we have to acknowledge that and move on. So we have awesome stories that people come here by the millions to learn about. So we need to embrace those stories and tell our stories. So embrace your history, because your history is part of who we are. So my history, your history, the school children throughout South Carolina who are learning eighth grade, they're learning South Carolina history. We're taking all of those stories and putting them together. We are a big melting pot, and that is going to make us stronger for the future. You know, diversity is something that's part of our future, and it makes us resilient. So if you're going into a stressful situation, do you want an armor made out of a brittle material or a resilient material? You want the resilient material. So just like the spongy palmetto trees at Fort Moultrie in 1776 that absorbed the cannonballs shot by the British Navy, or the British cannonballs bounced off of that spongy palmetto, we need to be strengthened by our diversity and strengthened by our own past, so that insults and prejudice and injustice will bounce right off of our low-country South Carolina skin and make us stronger citizens. And that's the end of my little philosophical rant for today, but in closing, I want to implore all of you to help us to create a more safe, resilient, and equitable world. And our little microcosm of low-country South Carolina history, I think we've got a lot of lessons from the past that can help us to do exactly that. So, thank you very much for your attention.